Albert DeSalvo. On the morning of November 25, 1973, a guard doing routine rounds at Walpole State Prison walked into the infirmary and found a 42-year-old inmate lying face down on his cot, soaked in blood from 16 stab wounds. Just days earlier, that man had told people close to him that he was ready to drop a bomb. New information that would change everything people thought they knew about the most terrifying murder spree Boston had ever seen. His name was Albert DeSalvo, and for a decade, the world had known him as the Boston Strangler. Between June 14, 1962, and January 4, 1964, 13 women between the ages of 19 and 85 were found strangled in their Boston area apartments. Most had been killed with a piece of their own clothing, a stocking, a scarf, a pillowcase, tied into a decorative bow around their neck. The city was paralyzed. Newspapers called the unknown killer the Phantom Strangler, then the Mad Strangler of Boston. Women barricaded their doors, neighbors stopped trusting neighbors, and the police had nothing. DeSalvo grew up in Chelsea, Massachusetts, the son of an abusive alcoholic father who beat his wife and children savagely. He served as a military police sergeant in West Germany, married a German woman named Irmgard Beck, and returned to a quiet life in Malden with his wife and 2 children. But beneath that surface, DeSalvo was already a serial offender. He had been prowling apartments across New England for years, posing as a talent scout or a building maintenance worker to gain access to women's homes, assaulting hundreds of victims in a string of attacks that earned him the names the Measuring Man and the Green Man. His downfall came in October of 1964, when a woman in East Cambridge survived an attack and gave police a description. Women across the region identified DeSalvo's photograph. While held at Bridgewater State Hospital, he made a confession to his attorney, F. Lee Bailey. He claimed in granular detail that he was the Boston Strangler. But here is what most people never learn. Albert DeSalvo was never tried for a single one of those 13 stranglings. Not one. In January of 1967, he was convicted only of the unrelated Green Man assaults and sentenced to life in prison. After a brief escape from Bridgewater in February of 1967, DeSalvo was transferred to Walpole's segregation unit. Inside, he made leather goods and jewelry, including chokers of all things, and was suspected of running an amphetamine operation behind bars. He eventually recanted his strangler confession entirely, leaving everyone to wonder whether he had been telling the truth or lying for attention. Then came the night in the infirmary. DeSalvo had reportedly been trying to arrange a meeting with his doctor, telling associates he had something explosive to reveal. Before that meeting ever happened, someone walked into that infirmary and drove a blade into him over and over again. A Winter Hill gang associate named Robert Wilson was tried for the murder, but the jury deadlocked, and the case remains officially unsolved to this day. His own attorney later said the killing was payback. DeSalvo had been undercutting the prices of the inmate-controlled drug trade, and that was a death sentence all on its own. For 40 years, the question of whether DeSalvo really was the Boston Strangler hung in the air like smoke. Then, on July 19, 2013, Boston police surveillance expert Sergeant Brian Albert followed DeSalvo's nephew Tim to a construction site in Boston and waited. When Tim finished a water bottle and tossed it in the trash, Albert retrieved it. The DNA from that bottle was matched against biological evidence preserved from the body of the Strangler's final victim, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan. The Suffolk County District Attorney announced the results with near certainty. Albert DeSalvo had killed Mary Sullivan. But those other 12 women attributed to the Strangler, their cases remain forensically unconfirmed. Some criminologists believe there were multiple killers operating in Boston during those terrifying months. We may never know the full truth. What we do know is that DeSalvo died the way he lived, violently, behind bars, with secrets still buried in his chest alongside those knife wounds. He was not the only killer inside Walpole whose crimes reached far beyond those concrete walls. 2 decades later, another young man arrived at the same prison after committing an act of violence so brazen it made national headlines before the blood on the clinic floor had even dried. John Salvi. On the morning of December the 30th, 1994, a 22-year-old apprentice hairdresser from Hampton, New Hampshire, walked into a reproductive health clinic on Beacon Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, carrying a black duffel bag. Inside that bag was a modified .22 caliber Ruger rifle and 700 rounds of ammunition. Within the next 10 minutes, 2 women would be dead, and 5 more people would be fighting for their lives. John C. Salvi III had been unraveling for years. His family would later describe a young man consumed by psychiatric illness, paranoid, erratic, increasingly detached from reality, fixated on disturbing images he plastered across the dashboard of his pickup truck. The people around him saw the warning signs. Nobody acted on them. But on that December morning, whatever storm had been building inside him finally broke. It was a Friday, the last working day before New Year's Eve. The clinic waiting rooms were full. Salvi entered the Planned Parenthood clinic at 1031 Beacon Street, pulled the rifle from the duffel bag, and opened fire. Shannon Loney, a 25-year-old receptionist, was killed. 3 others were wounded. Then Salvi walked out, got back in his truck, and drove 2 miles east on Beacon Street to the Preterm Health Services Clinic. He walked inside and shot receptionist Lee Ann Nichols, 38 years old, 10 times at point-blank range. She died on the floor. 2 more people were wounded in the chaos, and security guard Richard J. Saron exchanged gunfire with Salvi, taking 4 rounds in the arms and 1 through his left hand before Salvi fled. What Salvi left behind was a duffel bag containing those 700 rounds and a receipt that gave investigators everything they needed. The next day, Salvi was arrested in Norfolk, Virginia, after firing more than a dozen shots into another clinic. President Clinton called the Brookline attacks domestic terrorism. Cardinal Bernard Law condemned them as reprehensible acts of violence with absolutely no justification whatsoever. On March 18, 1996, a Massachusetts jury rejected Salvi's insanity defense and convicted him of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 5 counts of armed assault with intent to murder. He received 2 consecutive life sentences without parole. Lee Ann Nichols' mother, Ruth, stood in that courtroom and called him a little man with a big gun who shot her daughter in the back. Salvi was transferred to MCI Cedar Junction, Walpole, in July of 1996. Despite the fact that a defense psychiatrist had diagnosed him with schizophrenia during the trial, he was placed in general population. He was not put on suicide watch. He received no mental health treatment. No one checked on the state of his mind. For 5 months, a man that a qualified doctor had identified as severely mentally ill sat in one of the most violent prisons in the country with no psychiatric intervention whatsoever. On November 29, 1996, at approximately 6:05 in the morning, guards found 24-year-old John Salvi under his bed in his locked cell. His hands and feet were bound with shoelaces. A plastic garbage bag was tied over his head. He was pronounced dead at 6:55 a.m. The cause was asphyxiation. It was ruled a suicide, a determination that raised its own set of questions given the complexity of the bindings. He was the 6th Massachusetts state inmate to die by suicide since July of 1995, a rate that itself should have set off alarms. His attorney, James Sultan, said afterward that people might not shed tears for John Salvi, but they should shed tears for a system that failed completely, a criminal justice system that could not deal with mental illness. Salvi's mother, Anne Marie, said simply that her young John was gone, but that others would continue to suffer in prison instead of a mental hospital where they belonged. On February 1, 1997, a judge invoked a legal doctrine called abatement ab initio and vacated Salvi's conviction entirely, meaning that in the eyes of the law, the case was erased as though it had never been tried. That same obscure doctrine would surface again, 2 decades later, in one of the most high-profile criminal cases in American sports history. And that case also ended with a body hanging in a Massachusetts prison cell. Aaron Hernandez. In the summer of 2012, Aaron Hernandez was living the life that most people only dream about. A 22-year-old tight end for the New England Patriots, fresh off playing in the Super Bowl. He had just signed a 5-year contract extension worth up to $40 million with a $12.5 million signing bonus. At the time, the largest contract ever given to a tight end in the NFL. 14 months later, he would be in handcuffs, charged with murder, and cut from the team within 90 minutes of his arrest. On June 17, 2013, 27-year-old semi-pro football player Odin Lloyd was found dead in an industrial park in North Attleboro, Massachusetts, less than a mile from Hernandez's home. He had been shot 6 times, including twice in the chest, while he was already on the ground. Lloyd had been dating Shania Jenkins, the sister of Hernandez's own fiancée, Cheyana Jenkins. That evening, Hernandez, along with associates Carlos Ortiz and Ernest Wallace, had picked Lloyd up from his Dorchester home in a rented Nissan Altima. They drove him to that industrial park, and they left him there to die. Hernandez was arrested on June 26, 2013. The New England Patriots released him the same day. On April 15, 2015, a Bristol County jury convicted him of first-degree murder and 5 firearms charges. The sentence was automatic: life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was booked into MCI Cedar Junction as inmate number W106228 before being transferred to the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center in Lancaster. In April of 2017, in a separate trial, Hernandez was acquitted of a 2012 double murder in Boston's South End, the killings of Daniel de Abreu and Safiro Furtado. 5 days after that acquittal, in the early morning hours of April 19, 2017, a corrections officer found Aaron Hernandez hanging from a bedsheet attached to his cell window in G2, cell 57 at Sousa Baranowski. He was 27 years old. He had jammed cardboard into the tracks of his cell door to prevent guards from getting in quickly. He was pronounced dead at 4:07 a.m. at UMass Memorial Hospital. He left behind 3 handwritten notes, one to his attorney Jose Baez, one to his fiancée Cheyana, and one to his 4-year-old daughter Aviel. In the note to Cheyana, he had underlined 2 words twice: "You're rich," a reference that many believe pointed to the abatement ab initio doctrine, the same legal principle that had erased John Salvi's conviction after his death. And sure enough, in May of 2017, Judge E. Susan Garsh vacated Hernandez's murder conviction under that exact doctrine. But this time, the story did not end there. Odin Lloyd's mother, Ursula Ward, was unwavering. In her eyes, he was guilty, and he was always going to be guilty. The Bristol County District Attorney said flatly that Hernandez died a guilty man and a convicted murderer, and that fact was indisputable. On March 13, 2019, The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court unanimously reinstated the conviction, ruling that the abatement doctrine was outdated and no longer fit the realities of modern life. It was the end of a legal loophole that had quietly existed in Massachusetts for generations. 7 months after his death, researchers at Boston University's CTE Center made an announcement that reframed the entire case. Dr. Ann McKee revealed that Hernandez had been suffering from stage 3 chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a degenerative brain disease caused by repeated head trauma. She said the damage was unlike anything they had ever seen in their collection of 468 brains, except in individuals who were decades older. Whether that disease played a role in his violence remains scientifically contested. CTE can only be diagnosed after death, and many people who have it never commit violent acts. But the finding cast a long shadow over the case, over the NFL, and over the question of what football does to the human brain. Hernandez is gone. His conviction stands. But the machinery of organized crime that fed Massachusetts, its worst nightmares did not begin or end with a football player. It began decades earlier in the blood-soaked streets of Roxbury and South Boston with a man whose body count may never be fully known. A decorated war hero who spent half a century killing for the Winter Hill Gang while secretly working as an FBI informant. Stephen Flemmi. There is a particular kind of monster who can sit across from a federal judge, admit to 10 murders, reference his involvement in roughly 50 killings stretching back to the 1960s, and still walk out of that courtroom alive because the government needs him more than it needs justice. Stephen Flemmi is that monster. And as of 2026, at 91 years old, he is still breathing, locked away in an undisclosed federal facility under witness protection, with a calculated release date of May 4, 2218. Flemmi was born on June 9, 1934, in Boston's Roxbury neighborhood to Italian-American parents. He served in the Korean War with the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team, earned a Silver Star and a Bronze Star, and returned to Boston, a decorated combat veteran. But whatever discipline the military instilled in him was quickly redirected. By the mid-1960s, the FBI had recruited him as a top-echelon informant, first under Agent H. Paul Rico, then under the infamous John Connolly. His code names were Jack from South Boston, and later Shogun. For the next 3 decades, Flemmi fed the Bureau intelligence on the Italian Mafia, while simultaneously participating in the very violence he was supposed to be reporting on. The list of the dead is staggering. Edward Wimpy Bennett, killed January 19, 1967. His brother Walter, killed less than 3 months later. Their brother Billy, killed that December. Edward Connors, shotgunned in a Dorchester phone booth in 1975. Former World Jai President John Callahan, lured to Florida and executed in 1982. Tulsa businessman Roger Wheeler, shot in 1981. And those are just the names with confirmed dates. But 2 of Flemmi's victims demand special attention because they reveal the full depth of what this man was. In September of 1981, 26-year-old Deborah Davis was lured to a vacant house in South Boston. Flemmi had made a catastrophic mistake. He had revealed to her that he and his partner, James Whitey Bulger, were FBI informants. That knowledge sealed her fate. When she walked through the door, Bulger grabbed her by the throat. Flemmi later recalled watching as Bulger told him to step aside, that he would take care of it. Then Bulger strangled her. Flemmi helped bury her body near the Neponset River while Bulger watched. Years later, Flemmi told a courtroom that what happened to Deborah Davis had affected him and would affect him until the day he died. Whether that was remorse or performance is something only he knows. Then there was Deborah Hussey, killed in 1985. She was 26 years old. She was Flemy's stepdaughter. She had suffered years of abuse at his hands, a pattern of harm that began when she was a child and continued for years. Bulger strangled her in a South Boston house while Flemy was present. Her body was buried alongside others in a makeshift graveyard of the Winter Hill Gang's making. In 1995, Flemy was indicted alongside Bulger on racketeering charges. Bulger fled and spent 16 years as one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. Flemy stayed. He cut a deal. In 2003, he pleaded guilty in federal court to 10 murders, racketeering, and a string of related charges. He received a life sentence instead of the death penalty. In exchange, he became the government's most devastating cooperating witness, testifying against Bulger in 2013 and against his own childhood friend, Cadillac Frank Salem, in 2018. The Florida Parole Commission unanimously denied his request for compassionate medical release on August 18, 2021. Deborah Davis's brother Stephen called Flemy a modern-day Charles Manson. His next parole eligibility is not until 2028. Flemy is the only one of these 10 inmates still being held in active federal protective custody. He betrayed everyone, his partners, his victims, the bureau that protected him, and the families who trusted him. And the man he betrayed most spectacularly, his lifelong friend who once ran the New England Mafia from the same streets they grew up on, died in a federal prison infirmary just a few years ago, still insisting that Flemy was the real serpent in the room. Francis Cadillac Frank Salem. If you wanted to understand what the New England underworld looked like at its most treacherous, you could start with a single image. A man staggering back through the front door of an IHOP in Saugus, Massachusetts, with bullets in his stomach and knee, bleeding onto the tile floor of a pancake restaurant on a Tuesday morning in June of 1989. That man was Francis Patrick Salem, and the fact that he survived that assassination attempt only to die decades later in a federal prison hospital tells you everything about how the mob rewards loyalty. Salem was born August 18, 1933, in Weymouth, Massachusetts, to an Irish mother and an Italian father. He grew up in Jamaica Plain, served in the Army during Korea, got his electrician's license, and earned the nickname Cadillac Frank from the years he spent repairing luxury cars at a garage he co-owned. But the garage was a front, and the real work was violence. He and Stephen Flemy had been close since childhood, and together they moved through the Boston gang wars of the 1960s like a blade through paper. In 1965, Salem carried out one of the most audacious hits of that era, the attempted assassination of Edward Punchy McLaughlin outside Beth Israel Hospital in a disguise that included a rabbi's hat and coat, firing a shotgun at close range. On January 31, 1968, he planted a car bomb beneath attorney John E. Fitzgerald's vehicle in Everett, Massachusetts. The explosion blew off Fitzgerald's left leg. The purpose was to intimidate Joe the Animal Barboza into silence before he could testify against the Patriarca crime family. Salem was convicted in 1973 and sentenced to 16 years. He served nearly 15. When he came out, he rose fast. By 1991, Salem had become the boss of the Patriarca crime family, the head of the New England Mafia. Then came the IHOP. On June 16, 1989, gunmen from the rival Russo and Ferrara faction caught him outside the restaurant and opened fire. He took rounds to the stomach and knee, but he did not go down. He staggered back inside, collapsed onto a booth, and survived. In 1995, he was indicted alongside Bulger and Flemy, and when he learned the truth, that his childhood friend Flemmy and their partner Bulger had been FBI informants for decades, feeding the government information while the three of them committed crimes side by side. Something in Salem broke. He cooperated with the government. He entered witness protection in 1999. But Salem had a secret of his own, and it had been buried for over 20 years. In 1993, nightclub owner Stephen DeSaro, a 43-year-old father of five who ran a South Boston venue called The Channel, was strangled in Salem's own home. Salem's son, Frank Jr., and associate Paul Wiedek carried out the killing while Salem watched. They buried the body behind a mill in Providence, Rhode Island, where it remained hidden until it was unearthed in 2016. The government had given Salem protection. They had given him a new identity. And the entire time, he had been lying about DeSaro's murder. He was kicked out of witness protection in 2004 for that lie, then somehow readmitted. In 2016, federal agents found him hiding in a Connecticut hotel under the alias Richard Parker. He was arrested and charged with the murder of a federal witness. On June 22, 2018, Salem was convicted alongside Paul Wiedek. The sentence was mandatory life. Lead prosecutor Fred Weishaupt called Salem ruthless and barbaric, a man who richly deserved to spend every remaining day of his life behind bars. Salem himself had said it years earlier in a moment of rare candor. "You are not going to beat the government one way or the other. They are going to get you." He was right. On December 13, 2022, Francis Cadillac Frank Salem died at the age of 89 at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. Stephen DeSaro's son Nick had one thing to say: "The world was better off without him. Good riddance." Salem and Flemmy grew up on the same streets, committed crimes in the same crews, and ultimately destroyed each other. One is dead. The other is locked in a cage the government built to keep him alive long enough to testify whenever they need him. Between them, the body count stretches into the dozens, a legacy of blood that ran from the gang wars of the 60s all the way into the 21st century. But Walpole held more than mob bosses and strangler confessions. It held men whose crimes were so personal, so targeted, that they shook the conscience of an entire state. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Joseph Druce, on August 23, 2003, inside the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center in Shirley, Massachusetts, a convicted killer slipped into a protective custody cell, jammed the door shut with a book he had pre-cut to fit the track, and strangled a 68-year-old defrocked Catholic priest with a pair of socks he had spent hours stretching into a garrote. By the time guards forced the door open, the priest was dead on the floor. The killer was proud of it, and a large portion of the public was not sure they disagreed with him. Joseph Druce was born Darren Ernest Smilage on April 15, 1965. He legally changed his name years later. He was a self-described neo-Nazi, a reputed Aryan Nation associate, and a man who had endured physical and other forms of abuse during childhood in a residential reform school. Trauma that shaped the particular hatred that would define his life behind bars. His first killing came in June of 1988. George Rollo, a 51-year-old Massachusetts bus driver, picked Druce up while hitchhiking. According to Druce, Rollo made an unwanted advance. Druce attacked him, bound him, forced him into the trunk of his own car, and drove to a deserted theater parking lot in Beverly, Massachusetts. He strangled Rollo there, despite the man's pleas. In 1989, a jury rejected Druce's insanity defense, and he was sentenced to life. Inside the Massachusetts prison system, Druce made himself impossible to ignore. He mailed his own feces to the state attorney general's office. Around 2001, he sent anthrax hoax letters to attorneys with Jewish surnames. He cycled through facilities including Walpole, where he served time before being transferred to Sousa Baranowski. It was there that he encountered John J. Jayagan. Jayagan was a defrocked Catholic priest, serving 9 to 10 years for a crime involving a child. He had been accused of harming roughly 150 children over the course of his career in the church, a scope of institutional misconduct that became the catalyst for the Boston Archdiocese abuse crisis, later documented in the film Spotlight. When Druce learned that Jayagan was in his facility, he began planning. On the morning of August 23, 2003, Druce slipped into Jayagan's cell undetected. He jammed the door with a pre-cut book wedged into the track. He bound Jayagan's hands behind his back with a torn t-shirt. Then he wrapped the stretched socks around Jayagan's neck, pulled them tight, and stomped him until the man stopped moving. The autopsy listed the cause of death as ligature strangulation and blunt chest trauma. The Worcester County District Attorney said Druce was absolutely proud of what he had done. A man filled with long-standing hatred, driven by a fixation that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with rage. On January 25, 2006, a Worcester jury convicted Druce of first-degree murder and handed him a second life sentence without parole. During the trial, Druce took the stand and said he had seen himself as the designated individual who had to put a stop to the harm inside the church. The prosecutor cut through that framing. Druce was not mentally ill and raging out of control, he said. He was a calculating individual who waited for his opportunity. In June of 2007, the Boston Herald received a letter from Druce containing a link to internal Sousa Baranowski security footage of the killing, posted on YouTube. The Department of Correction launched an investigation into how a man with no internet access had leaked surveillance video from inside a maximum security facility. That question was never publicly answered. Druce remains incarcerated today, serving 2 life sentences in a system that could not protect the worst of its inmates from each other. His case forced a different kind of reckoning about what happens when the public feels more sympathy for the killer than the victim. That tension between outrage and sympathy ran through Walpole like a current. But in 1997, a case arrived that left no room for ambiguity, a crime against a child so monstrous that it nearly brought back the death penalty in Massachusetts. Charles Janes. On the evening of October 1, 1997, a 10-year-old boy from East Cambridge, Massachusetts, climbed into the back of a 1983 gray Cadillac, expecting to get a new bicycle. He had been promised one by 2 men who had been cultivating his trust for weeks, showing up in his neighborhood, giving him rides, buying him things. The boy's name does not need to be repeated here. What matters is that he never came home. Charles Janes was 22 years old at the time. He weighed roughly 300 pounds. He was affiliated with an organization that openly advocated for the elimination of age of consent laws. He worked at a Newton auto dealership, where he met his co-defendant, 21-year-old Salvatore Sicari, who lived a block away from the victim's family in East Cambridge. Together, they had been manipulating the child's trust for weeks, using gifts and attention to build a relationship that served no purpose other than exploitation. That October evening, after luring the boy into the Cadillac under the pretense of a bicycle and $50, Janes and Sicari drove to a Newton grocery store parking lot. In the back seat of that car, Janes, a grown man weighing nearly 300 pounds, sat on top of the child, who stood 4 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 80 pounds. He smothered the boy with a gasoline-soaked rag when the child fought back. The boy was 10 years old. They drove the body to Janes's apartment in New Hampshire. They sealed it in a Rubbermaid storage container weighted with concrete. The next morning, they dumped the container in the Great Works River in South Berwick, Maine. The body was recovered 6 days later, on October 7th. Investigators found literature from the organization Janes belonged to in his car and apartment. Sakari was convicted of first-degree murder in 1998 and sentenced to life without parole. Janes was convicted of second-degree murder and kidnapping. His sentence was life with the possibility of parole, plus an additional 9 to 10 years. That sentencing distinction would haunt the victim's family for decades. Inside the Massachusetts prison system, Janes gave the family no peace. He cycled through Walpole, Concord, and other state facilities. At one point, a fellow inmate at MCI Concord later told Channel 5 that Janes had screamed through the cell block that he would not hesitate to do it again, that he would pull the child from the grave and do it again and again. In 2012, Janes petitioned a Brockton court to legally change his name to Manasseh Invictus Auric Thutmose V, claiming Wiccan religious significance. Wiccan organizations publicly disavowed him, and the request was denied. At his first parole hearing in June of 2020, Janes made his first public admission. He told the board he was not there to ask for parole. He was there to take responsibility for his murder of the child. He said he was guilty, and he had committed that murder. The parole board denied him in October of 2021, calling his statements self-serving and finding no evidence of rehabilitation or any commitment to addressing the behavior that led to the killing. His next hearing is in 5 years. The victim's father called Janes the face of the devil, pure and evil. His brother said Janes should remain in prison until the day he dies. The family filed a $200 million civil lawsuit against the organization, whose literature was found in Janes's car, but dropped it in 2008 after a key witness was ruled incompetent. In the Massachusetts legislature, the case came within a single vote of restoring the death penalty in 1997. 1 vote. That is how close this crime brought the state to reversing decades of legal precedent. Janes is alive. Sakari is alive. Both are serving life. The boy they killed was 10 years old, and the wound they left in that family and that community has never closed. But the Massachusetts prison system held another killer whose crimes were so random, so senseless, that they forced the federal government to do something the state of Massachusetts had refused to do for more than 50 years: impose a death sentence. Gary Lee Sampson. The day before Gary Lee Sampson killed his first victim, he picked up a payphone and called the FBI to turn himself in. He was a fugitive. He was wanted for a string of bank robberies in North Carolina. He was tired of running. An FBI clerk took the call, and then the line went dead, accidentally disconnected. Nobody called back. Nobody followed up. The next day, Sampson started killing strangers who made the mistake of offering him a ride. Sampson was born September 29, 1959, in Weymouth, Massachusetts, and raised in Abington by a father who was a firefighter and, by multiple accounts, physically abusive. Despite what defense experts later described as exceptional underlying intelligence, Sampson was never diagnosed or treated for the intellectual and emotional difficulties that defined his early life. He drifted through multiple marriages, petty crime, and eventually armed robbery. By the spring of 2001, he was robbing banks in North Carolina and running out of road. In July of 2001, Sampson went on a 6-day killing spree across 2 states. His first victim was Philip McCloskey, a 69-year-old retired pipefitter from Taunton, Massachusetts, who picked Sampson up while he was hitchhiking. Sampson forced McCloskey at knife point into the woods in Marshfield, tied him to a tree with his own belt, and stabbed him 24 times. His second victim was Jonathan Rizzo, a 19-year-old college student from Kingston, Massachusetts, who picked Sampson up after a Friday night work shift. Sampson forced Rizzo into the woods in Abington, tied him to a tree with yellow rope, gagged him, and stabbed him to death. His third victim was Robert Eli Whitney, a 58-year-old caretaker from the Concord, New Hampshire area. Sampson broke into a lake house in Meredith, New Hampshire, using Whitney's stolen car. He tied Whitney to a chair and strangled him. He tried to kill a fourth person, William Gregory, in Plymouth, Vermont, but Gregory escaped by throwing himself from a moving car. Sampson then called 911 on himself from a Vermont ski chalet and surrendered. 3 good Samaritans. 3 men who stopped their cars to help a stranger on the side of the road, all 3 dead within a week. Sampson pleaded guilty on September 9, 2003. On December 23rd of that year, a federal jury in Boston sentenced him to death, the first federal death sentence handed down in Massachusetts since 1947. The state had abolished its own death penalty in 1984, and the last state execution had been carried out nearly 60 years earlier. But because Sampson's crimes crossed state lines, the case fell under federal jurisdiction, and federal law still carried the ultimate penalty. The sentence was vacated in 2011 after a juror was found to have lied about her background during jury selection. In January of 2017, a new federal jury sentenced Sampson to death again for the Rizzo murder, but deadlocked on the McCloskey count, which resulted in a life sentence for that killing. He had also pleaded guilty to Whitney's murder in New Hampshire and received life there. Sampson was held at MCI Cedar Junction during portions of his Massachusetts proceedings before being transferred to federal custody. Federal death row inmates are housed at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. On December 21, 2021, Gary Lee Sampson died of natural causes at the age of 62 at the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. The First Circuit Court of Appeals declined to vacate his conviction or death sentence, even though his appeal was unfinished, ruling that his convictions, life sentence, and death sentence remained intact. Jonathan Rizzo's mother, Mary, said in court filings that Sampson was an evil man, and that the idea of his conviction being wiped away was an insult to her family. Sampson died before the government could execute him. The needle never came. But the sentence stood, a reminder that even in a state that rejected capital punishment, the federal government was willing to make an exception when the crimes were savage enough. And savagery, as it turned out, was something the 1960s had no shortage of. 1,200 miles south of Walpole, in a Manhattan apartment on a sweltering August morning, a crime unfolded that would reshape American law itself. Richard Robles. On the morning of August 28, 1963, a 21-year-old burglar named Richard Robles climbed from a hallway ledge through an open kitchen window into apartment 3C at 57 East 88th Street, on Manhattan's Upper East Side. He expected the apartment to be empty. It was not. What happened inside that apartment over the next hour would destroy 2 young women, wrongfully imprison an innocent man, and become a footnote in one of the most important Supreme Court decisions in American history. Robles was born in 1942 in Manhattan. He was a heroin addict and a burglar with a prior conviction, out on parole and looking for anything he could sell. The apartment he chose belonged to 3 young professional women, roommates living the kind of independent urban life that 1960s New York promised, and the tabloids feared. 2 of them were home that morning. Janice Wiley was 21 years old, a researcher at Newsweek and the niece of novelist Philip Wiley. She was asleep when Robles came through the window. He attacked her. when her roommate Emily Hoffert, a 23-year-old elementary school teacher, returned home and walked in on the scene. Robles turned on her too. Hoffert told him she would identify him. He bound the two women together and attacked them with kitchen knives and glass bottles, killing them both. The third roommate, Patricia Tolles, a Time Life staffer, came home from work that evening and found the bodies. The New York press called it the Career Girl murders, and the case became a referendum on whether young women could safely live alone in the city. But the first person arrested for those murders was not Richard Robles. In April of 1964, the NYPD picked up George Whitmore, Jr., a 19-year-old Black Day laborer with intellectual disabilities, in Brooklyn. After 26 hours of interrogation, detectives extracted a 61-page confession. It was false, every word of it. Whitmore had been in Wildwood, New Jersey, on the day of the murders, watching the march on Washington on television. He was eventually cleared, but the damage was done to his life and to the credibility of confession-based policing in America. The United States Supreme Court cited Whitmore's case directly in Miranda v. Arizona in 1966, calling it the most conspicuous example of a coerced false confession in recent memory. Robles was identified in February of 1965 when a narcotics dealer named Nathan Jimmy Delaney, facing his own murder charge, gave up the name. The NYPD planted wiretaps at 3 locations and arrested Robles in October of 1965. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree felony murder in December of that year and sentenced to natural life, later converted to parole eligible after a 1970s legislative change. At his November 1986 parole hearing at Eastern Correctional Facility, Robles confessed for the first time. He described climbing through the window, finding Wiley in the apartment, and the moment the thought entered his mind that he had to kill. He said he looked in a mirror afterward, and the blood had drained from his face. He looked like a ghost. He was denied parole. He was denied again and again, more than 17 consecutive times over the following decades. Robles was a New York State prisoner, inmate number 66-0003 in the New York Department of Corrections, held at Attica, Auburn, Eastern, Otisville, and Greene correctional facilities across the state. He was never incarcerated at Walpole or in any Massachusetts facility. He appears on this list not because he walked those corridors, but because his crime belongs to the same era, the same national reckoning with violence that filled Walpole's cells in the first place, and because the wrongful arrest of George Whitmore, Jr. did more to change how American police conduct interrogations than perhaps any other single case in the 20th century. According to state records, Robles was released on parole in May of 2020, after more than 54 years behind bars. Whether he is alive today is not publicly confirmed. His case, and the innocent man who nearly paid for his crime, is a reminder that the line between guilt and innocence in America has never been as clean as the courts pretend. And the last man on this list understood that better than anyone, because the last inmate to earn a place in Walpole's darkest history did not just kill, he dismembered, he mutilated, and he took his secrets to a grave that may not have been his own choosing. Tony Costa. In the winter of 1969, police searching a patch of woods outside Provincetown, Massachusetts, uncovered something that made seasoned investigators go pale. The body of a young woman, cut into 8 pieces and buried in a shallow grave. And then another body, and another, and another. All of them dismembered, some of them missing organs, some bearing marks that the medical examiner could only describe as bite wounds. The press had a name for the man responsible before the trial even started: the Cape Cod Vampire. Antone Charles Costa was born August 2nd, 1944, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His father died in World War II, and he was raised by his mother and stepfather in Provincetown, the kind of small, tight-knit Cape Cod town where everybody knew everybody. Costa's first violent offense came at 17, a home invasion in Somerville in November of 1961. He married in 1963, had 3 children, and divorced after his drug use spiraled. He moved to California in 1966, drifted through counterculture circles, and came back to the Cape carrying a darkness that the people around him either could not see or chose to ignore. Between the summer of 1968 and January of 1969, 4 young women vanished in and around Provincetown. Sydney Monzone, 18, disappeared in the spring of '68. Susan Perry, 17, was last seen over Labor Day weekend that same year. Patricia Walsh, 23, and Mary Ann Wysocki, 23, were visiting from Rhode Island and were last seen on January 24, 1969. On February 8, 1969, a search near the spot where Walsh's Volkswagen had been abandoned led investigators to Susan Perry's remains, dismembered into 8 pieces and buried in the dirt. Over the following weeks, they found Wysocki, Walsh, and Monzone in the same clearing, all of them cut apart and placed in shallow graves. That clearing doubled as Costa's secret marijuana garden. Walsh's skin had been separated from her chest in a way the coroner compared to peeling off a sweater. The bodies showed gunshot wounds from a .22 caliber weapon, knife mutilation, evidence of necrophilia, and what the medical examiner described as bite marks. Author Casey Sherman, who reviewed the crime scene photographs years later, said the women had not just been murdered. They had been brutalized in a way that looked less like a human attack and more like the work of something feral. Costa knew all 4 victims. His fingerprints were on the torn cover of Walsh's Volkswagen owner's manual. He had been driving Walsh's van and had produced a forged bill of sale. Ballistics matched a buried .22 caliber weapon to the bodies. He was arrested in March of 1969. A court psychiatrist diagnosed him with schizoid personality disorder and called him a modern-day Marquis de Sade. At trial in May of 1970 in Barnstable County, Costa offered shifting stories and blamed the killings on an alter ego he called Carl, sometimes Corey. The jury did not buy it. He was convicted of the murders of Patricia Walsh and Mary Ann Wysocki and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court affirmed the conviction in 1971. Costa was sent to MCI Walpole, where he filled his cell with occult texts including Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible and wrote an unpublished novel called Resurrection that fictionalized the killings and continued to blame Carl. He reportedly lectured other inmates about the dangers of drug use, a grim irony, given that drugs had defined the trajectory of his life. He was assaulted multiple times behind bars. On May 12, 1974, a corrections officer found Tony Costa, 29 years old, hanging from a leather belt attached to the upper bars of his cell. The official cause of death was asphyxiation by hanging, ruled a suicide. But his attorney and at least 2 book-length biographers, Liza Rodman, who wrote The Babysitter, and Casey Sherman, who wrote Helltown, have argued that Costa was murdered by other inmates after he refused unwanted advances. The truth of how he died, like the true number of his victims, possibly as many as 8, went with him. Kurt Vonnegut wrote about Costa in Life magazine after learning that his own daughter Edith had narrowly avoided the man during a summer in Provincetown. Liza Rodman's 2021 memoir told a different version of that near miss. Her own mother had been friendly with Costa, and Rodman had spent childhood summers in close proximity to a man she did not yet know was a killer. The Cape Cod vampire became one of those figures who reveal how thin the line really is between ordinary life and the worst thing you can imagine. The smiling neighbor, the helpful acquaintance, the man your mother trusted with her children. Costa is dead. The women he killed are still being mourned, and the prison that held him, Walpole State Prison, MCI Cedar Junction, finally closed its doors in June of 2023, after nearly 7 decades of housing the worst that Massachusetts had to offer. 10 inmates, 10 lives destroyed by violence, and hundreds more shattered in the fallout. Walpole is closed now, but the stories it held are not going anywhere, and neither are we. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.